My wife recently bought some outdoor patio furniture. Now you might be asking, why didn't I just build it? Well, my wife told me she didn't want me to build it because I spend too much time building stuff and she wanted me to be able to relax. I decided to give it a try. I walked outside, I sat down, and then I realized she didn't buy a coffee table. I'm gonna build one. Now, I don't have a lot of time to build this because I'm trying to do it before my wife realizes I'm in the shop and not relaxing on what's supposed to be my vacation. So with that in mind, I decided to do a simple outdoor coffee table. I'm thinking a concrete top. I'll use this melamine for a form and then some sort of white oak trestle style base. I took the melamine over to my table saw and I started ripping it down to the correct dimensions, which are just what I was making up on the spot because I didn't take any actual measurements. But I've made enough coffee tables to generally know what size it should be. For this one, I decided to make it 48 inches long by 18 inches wide, and I'm gonna make it just about 17 inches tall, which should be perfect for that outdoor sofa. So after cutting down a big piece of melamine for the base of my form, I ripped down some pieces to 2 1/4 inches. Those will make up the side of my form, and once they're attached to the 3/4 inch melamine, it should allow me to pour an 1.5 inch thick concrete top. Now, I want to hook all these pieces together to create my form, but I also want to remember that I do need to take it apart to release the concrete from the form when I'm all done. So I want it to stay together, but I also want to be able to pull it apart. So I decided to use CA glue to initially get everything in the right shape, and then I can sink some screws on all the sides, which I can remove once I'm ready to deform my concrete. Not like deform my concrete, like I'm gonna mess it up, but deform my concrete, like I'm gonna take the form off. I know that could be a little confusing, but hopefully you understand what I'm talking about. Anyways, a little CA glue here, a little CA glue there, a little CA glue everywhere, and we had the form in the correct shape. Then I used an Armana countersink bit, and I added some screws. Why I took the time to countersink these, I don't know. I'm just used to doing things in a certain way. I could have just driven them in the outside and let them be all ugly. It's literally going to get ripped apart in the end. But if you're going to do something, you might as well overdo something, as my dad always said. Actually, that's a lie. My dad never said that. Anywho, after getting my form together, I decided I didn't like the harshness of these perfectly squared off corners, and I wanted to make them rounded so that the whole top was a little bit softer and not so prison bed-ish. I thought about how to do that, and then I found this scrap piece of butcher block countertop left over from when I did the laundry room. It was exactly 1.5 inches thick, so I cut a little square out of my scrap butcher block, and I marked out the dead center of that square. Once I had the center, I went over to my drill press. I just grabbed a big old Forstner bit. I think this was maybe 1.75 inches or 2 inches, something like that. And I drilled a hole right through the center of that 1.5 inch thick piece of butcher block. You can probably guess where I'm going with this, but I'll keep showing you just in case you have no clue. Once I had a nice circle cut out in the middle, I went over to the bandsaw and then very, very carefully, I cut out the individual corners of said circle, which gave me these little scrap pieces that were the exact shape I wanted the corners of my concrete tabletop to look like. You just got to be careful that you make sure you get them as thin as possible and as uniform as possible. Then I went back over to my form and using a little CA glue, I glued each one of these little scraps in all 4 corners that would give me that rounded profile. But I wasn't really happy with the transition of the scrap butcher block to the melamine, and I thought it would show up when I actually pour the form and you'd have these weird corners. So I decided to take some Tyvek tape and just do a border around the entire inside of the form. so that the edge of the concrete would be nice and smooth once I take it out of the mold. This took a little while because I had to be really careful to just get the tape on the sides. And it did stick up a little high, so I took an X-Acto knife and I trimmed it all down when I was done so that it looked nice and clean. I was also very aware that there was going to be a pretty sharp edge on the top of the coffee table. So I took some silicone caulking and I added a bead of caulking around that edge all the way on the inside of the form. Then I cut down one of these plastic router corner template things I had laying in the drawer, and I used that rounded profile as a scraper to even out all that caulking so that it should give me a nice rounded over edge on top of the concrete once I pull it out of this form. It actually worked really good, and I was able to get a very nice consistent edge all the way around. While I waited for that silicone caulking to dry, it was time to start working on my table base. Now, I couldn't run to the lumber store because my wife would notice I was missing, so I had to use what I had in my lumber rack. Luckily, I found this giant piece of 8/4 white oak, which should work perfect to create some sort of cool looking trestle style base. First, I needed to mill this up and make sure it was nice and square. So I cut it into manageable bite-sized pieces, and then I went over to my joiner to edge joint it and face joint it so I would have two perfectly square and flat surfaces. Once I had those, I could send the entire thing through the planer to bring it down to a consistent thickness, and then I went over to the table saw to rip it into perfect 1 3/4 by 1 3/4 lengths. I can use these lengths to hook together and make my base. But by the time I was done milling that up, my silicone was dry and I thought I better get this concrete in the form so it can start curing. Now, because I don't want this top to crack, I'm using GFRC, or glass fiber reinforced concrete, that I got from concretecountertopsupply.com. It's basically just a lighter weight concrete with special additives to help it resist cracking, and then you also add glass fibers, which really make it super strong. I started out by pouring a bunch of water into my mixing bucket, in this case a garbage can because 5-gallon buckets are just too small. Then I add in the Fishstone Super 6 mixture, which helps resist cracking and makes the concrete easier to mix. And then I started pouring in the concrete. I mixed that up for a little bit, a little zip, a little zap, a little goop. And once it was a nice even consistency, I started adding in my glass fibers. Now you want to mix these into the mix so that they're thoroughly throughout the entire concrete mixture, but you don't want to overmix or it just obliterates the glass fibers and it can make the pour very hairy. So less is more. Now this was a little thicker than I initially wanted. Those glass fibers really sucked up a lot of the moisture, but I thought it would probably be okay. I just wore some gloves and I used my hands to kind of spread it around like pizza dough and push it into all the little nooks and crannies. Then I grabbed this tool. Now I forget what this thing's called. It's either called a screed or a screet. I've called it both in the past, and sometimes you get mad at me for saying the right thing, and sometimes you get mad at me for saying the wrong thing. So at this point, I'm just really confused and don't know what to call it. But I'm going to call it a scrod, because that's somewhere between a screet and a screed, and, well, you're going to get mad anyways, so might as well just purposely call it the wrong thing. Anyways, I took my scrod, I scrodded the top until it was nice and flat, and then using a reciprocating saw, I vibrated my entire form to get rid of any pesky air bubbles that might be trapped and show up on the top of my top. And with that, the concrete was poured and ready to sit and wait for it to cure. While I waited for that to happen, I decided to get back to working on my base. Whenever I do any sort of angular style table base or coffee table base, I like to do them in a very specific way that, in my opinion, is the easiest way to lay out a table base. And that is to cut a scrap piece of plywood that is the exact height and width that you want your base to be. And then all you have to do is draw all your angles and shapes directly onto that piece. And then once you have them drawn on that piece of scrap plywood, well, you just have to cut all the pieces out of wood to fit the different shapes, and your base is pretty much laid out. So I start by drawing my outside legs. Now they're going to have a slight splay. So I bring them all the way down to the lower corner and I kind of tuck them in at the top. Then I grab some of my stock pieces and using those to get the correct width, I set them right on that angled line that I drew on my plywood and I trace a line for the other side. Now I have the exact shape that I need that specific piece to be. I do the same exact thing on the opposite side and then I start drawing out my stretcher pieces. I put one at the very top, just like this, and then I put one down a little bit lower, just like this. Again, using all of my actual pieces to draw my lines so that I know everything is the correct width. In no time, I have the profile completely drawn out, and now all I have to do is cut out these individual pieces, and I'm ready to hook them together. So I start by laying one of my scrap pieces right on my pre-drawn lines. I flip over the board and I use the board as a straight edge to draw lines exactly where I need to cut it down to the right shape. This also gives me the exact angle that I have to cut it to, which means I really don't have to do any math. It's just drawing lines. And boom, I got the correct shape. Pretty easy. I do the exact same thing on the other side, and then I just lay some scrap pieces across for my stretchers, and I trace a line from the bottom off of my pre-cut side pieces. I cut those pieces down to the right length, I stick them in between, and I do the same thing down at the bottom. Now all of the pieces for my base are cut to the exact right size, the exact right angles, and I didn't use a lick of mathematics, which is pretty sweet. Because math sucks. Just don't tell my mom. She was actually my math teacher. Awkward. Once I had all the pieces cut for one side of my base, I cut identical pieces for the other side, and then I stuck them all together and started marking out for my joinery method. In this case, I'm going to do dominoes, but you could easily do half laps if you don't have a domino joiner. Of course, I used my patented hip thrust to drill out all my mortises. I mean, why wouldn't I? It's patented. And it didn't take long to get all the mortises drilled out on all of my pieces, so that all I had to do was glue them together with some dominoes. Now, I'm well aware that this is an outdoor piece of furniture, and sometimes glued up joints don't love being outside. I was going to glue the whole thing together with epoxy, but I didn't want to wait that long for it to dry. So I opted for Titebond 3, which is actually rated for outdoor use, so I'm just going to hope for the best, and we'll see. Now I'm sure at this point you're probably asking, is this all your base is going to be? These two little pieces? Is there going to be no connecting stretchers of any sort to give it strength, rigidity, to really hold up that heavy concrete top? Well, let me answer your question with a question. Do you really think I'm that crazy? Of course there's going to be some sort of connecting stretcher, but I'm literally making this base up as I go along, and I just hadn't thought that far ahead yet. But don't worry, I'm sure we'll figure it out at some point down the line. Pretty soon I had both of my little table base shapes glued up, and it was time to wait for that glue to dry. While I waited for that glue to dry, my concrete was nice and cured. It had been in this form for approximately 24 hours. Before I deformed it, again, taking it out of the form, not deforming it, I sanded down all the edges with the Rotex and just some 80 grit sandpaper to break up any loose overflow and avoid the edges of the concrete chipping out once I pulled the form. Then I took out all the screws and very carefully, so I didn't ding up my concrete, I started pulling the form apart. That CA glue was pretty easy to break off, and in no time I was revealing a beautifully poured concrete top. At least I assumed it was beautiful. I haven't actually seen the underside. And there's always a chance there's just a zillion air bubbles under there or a giant pocket you missed. I mean, you really don't know what it's going to look like until you lift the thing up. So I was a little nervous. I also forgot to take those screws out, so that was kind of silly. But I am happy to report that once I flipped the whole thing over, it looked pretty bad. Nah, I'm just kidding. It was perfect. I love how smooth of a top you get with that melamine form. I mean, it feels like glass. And the silicone caulking even worked perfect to give the edge a nice round over all the way around the top. So, with my concrete out of forms, it was time to start laying out the full width and length of my base. Now these are going to be my stretcher pieces. So I had to figure out exactly how long I needed those to be. Obviously I wanted the concrete to overhang on each side. So once I figured that out, which was approximately 42 inches, I went over to the miter saw and I cut those to length. Now, I want to add a nice, huge round over to all these pieces. Each one of my stock pieces are 1.75 inches. So I have this giant 7/8 inch round over, but I didn't want to just go to that round over because I was afraid it was going to tear the crap out of these pieces. So instead of going straight to the 7/8 inch round over, I started out on a 1/2 inch round over. And I broke all the edges with that first. This will greatly reduce the amount of material I have to take off with that giant router bit. Pretty soon I had the edges knocked down on all my pieces, so I went over to the router table. I chalked up the 7/8 inch round over in the table, and very carefully I started rounding over every edge on my stock. My ultimate goal here is to take my square stock and make it into essentially round stock. I know, but Jason, you can't get something perfectly round by using a roundover bit because on the last pass you lose your straight reference that the roundover bit's using and it's never gonna be perfect, blah, blah, blah. Yes, you are completely correct, but I don't really need this to be perfect. I just want it to be pretty close. The whole piece is already going to have more of a rough look with the concrete top, and I'm fine with the base being a little rough and showing a little character. So I'm going to get it as perfectly round as I can, hand sand the rest, and it just is what it is. If I wanted it perfectly round, well, I'd do it on the lathe, or I would just buy round stock pre-made. But this isn't that type of project. Because up until 24 hours ago, I didn't even know I was making it. So we're just gonna go with it. After I had all the roundovers cut on one piece, I just actually used the Rotex to break down any high spots and blend everything together. And then I went back over to the router table with my next piece. I added some more roundovers to that piece. And then I went back over to my workbench and I sanded it down again with the Rotex until eventually I had 3 pieces that were nice and smooth. And that's when I decided I might as well round over these little bases too so that everything matched. So once again, I chalked up a 1/2 inch round over in my little palm router. I broke all the edges with that to start, and they looked something like this. Ooh, Then I went back over to the router table with that beefy 7/8 inch roundover bit, and I rounded over everything for a second time on both sides. This is actually pretty easy because I had a lot to hold on to with these bases and I could go nice and slow, and pretty soon the base looked convincingly round. I mean, you would never guess that I just used a roundover bit and didn't start with round stock. Well, I mean, you would probably guess, but that's unfair. You've watched the whole video to this point. But my wife, she would never guess, because she doesn't even know what round stock is. So there. Now, I know what you're asking. How in the world, with all those being rounded over, are you going to connect those pieces to your rounded over stretcher pieces? And I'm glad you asked, because at this point I was wondering the exact same thing. And that's when I had an idea. I don't know if it's a good one, but it's an idea. Connecting square things to square things is a lot easier than connecting round things to round things. So I decided to make the joinery incredibly simple. I started off by taking 2 of my stretcher pieces and clamping them together. And then I made this little box jig thing to go on the end of my 2 pieces. This is going to hold them in the correct orientation, and it's going to allow me to drill a giant hole on each end of my 2 stretcher pieces. And if you're asking, why would you want to drill a giant hole on each end of your 2 stretcher pieces? Well, I have a plan. Just go with me on this. With my little jig tight against the end of my 2 stretcher pieces, I went back over to the drill press, and using my hole that I drilled in my jig, I drilled a hole all the way through the 2 stretcher pieces. But the hole was only halfway on one piece and halfway on the other, so I basically created 2 half circles on each of my pieces. Now I used an 1 3/4 Forstner bit, which is perfect to match that 7/8 roundover bit that I used to round over all the pieces. Are you starting to see where I'm going with all this? Now, you might notice that 2 of my stretcher pieces are shorter than the other one. I have one longer one. And that's because I decided I wanted the base legs to actually splay out at the bottom. So that longer piece is what's going to determine that splay. I think this will make more sense here in a second. Because I had a third piece that I needed a half circle cut into, I had to use one of my pre-drilled pieces up against the new piece, and then I used the jig again. Anyways, long story short, pretty soon I had half circles cut in all of my stretcher pieces, my 2 shorter pieces and my 1 longer piece. Next, it was time to dry fit everything together. You see, these half circles fit perfectly on the top of this base over here. And then they fit perfectly on the top of the other base over there. And then my longer stretcher piece fits perfectly on the bottom, but because it's longer, it creates a splay on those outside legs. And if you don't know what splay means, it just means that they don't go straight up and down. They kind of come out at an angle. Once I had all the pieces dry fit together, I used a bevel gauge to make sure that the splay, or angle, was the same on both sides. Once I had the splay right, I used some clamps to lock it in place, and then using a tape measure, I made sure that that middle stretcher was perfectly centered in between the outsides, and I clamped that in place. Then to hook all this together, I'm just going to use screws, because it's an outdoor piece of furniture, and if I orient the screws correctly, well, you're not going to see them, because they're going to be underneath that concrete top. So after countersinking my holes and pre-drilling, I just sent in some GRK 2 1/4 inch long screws, and I didn't even bother gluing them because glue is just gonna fail outside anyways. Potentially. Pretty soon I had the entire base screwed together. Well, I had the top 2 stretchers screwed together, and then I had to do this weird clamping thing to hold the bottom stretcher in place, and I screwed that from the bottom so that you wouldn't see those screws. And now it was time to try and figure out a way to attach a wood base to a concrete top. I gotta tell you, this was a head scratcher until I realized that it really didn't have to be that complicated. For starters, the concrete top is so flippin' heavy that it's not really gonna move around. It really just needs a little something to hold it in place. Gravity will do the rest. So I marked out equal distances in on those 2 stretchers, and I drilled a 1/4 inch hole all the way through the stretcher until it made contact with the concrete and made a little mark. This is going to be used as a reference mark to line up the holes in my stretchers with some holes that I'm about to drill in the concrete. Once I had all my holes drilled in those stretcher pieces, I lifted up the base, made sure that there was enough of a mark on my concrete for a reference, and then using a masonry drill bit, I drilled a 1/4 inch hole right where all those marks were. I had to be very careful here not to drill all the way through my concrete. I only went in, about an inch. Once I had all those holes drilled, well, then I just got some 1/4 inch concrete anchors and figured I'd drive them in place. These are little wedge anchors. You can pick these up at any big box store, and I've used them in the past in concrete, and they actually work pretty darn good. I did squirt a little Thixo inside each hole, just because a little more holding power couldn't hurt. And then very carefully, I tapped in the anchors until that sliding wedge collar was fully seated. Now, these anchors are made to be used with a nut and a washer, but I just really thought that wasn't necessary for this project because, as I mentioned, gravity is going to hold that top in place. So I just lined up the holes on the base with those concrete anchors, and using a mallet, or in this case a rubber-covered framing hammer, I just tapped the base over those anchors and let friction do the rest. And I'm going to call that good. No nuts? No problem. Wow, that's a sentence I never thought I would say, but here we are. With that, the coffee table was done. I'm literally not going to put any finish on this base because it's oak, and oak does surprisingly well outdoors, and I don't want to have to refinish it later. I'm just going to let it naturally gray out over time. I will, however, put a sealer on top of the concrete once the sun goes down and I'm not working in the direct heat of the day. But all in all, I thought this coffee table turned out pretty good for a quick day-and-a-half project. Now I can sit out here and truly relax knowing that there's nothing left to be built. I can just sit and drink my coffee and enjoy the morning. But the sun is going to come out in a little bit, and this patio currently doesn't have a cover over the top. I wonder how hard it would be. I could just build kind of a little timber frame structure right over the whole outdoor space. Doesn't seem to be that long. I think it's only like 12 feet maybe. I could probably build that in a day, day and a half tops. Could run it straight this way, and then once I get the cover on here, I could probably do some sort of outdoor kitchen. Get rid of that freestanding barbecue, do like a built-in barbecue and a bar. I think it would really add to the aesthetics of the house. Yeah, who needs a vacation anyways? Vacations are for suckers. Hey, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. Now you might not know this about me. I haven't always done woodworking. I used to own a textile printing company. Started it with my wife like 15 years ago. And when we started that company and I needed a website, I got on Squarespace. So naturally, as things progressed and transitioned and I started doing woodworking, I went back to Squarespace. Because Squarespace has a ton of really awesome tools. Like, one of their sweet new tools is their Squarespace Blueprint AI and SEO tools. You can basically start a completely personalized website with their new guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint. You choose from professionally curated layout and styling options to build a unique online presence from the ground up, tailored to your brand or business. And you optimize it for every device. Then you easily launch your website, get discovered, fast integration, optimized SEO tools, so you show up more often in searches to more people, and you can grow the way you want. When I first started my woodworking business, it was completely different than what it is now. I wasn't doing content, I wasn't even doing custom furniture, I was selling small little things. So the way I designed the website then is completely different from the way I want it now. But because you can alter the different templates and customize them to fit your needs, I was able to just seamlessly go from that website and transition into our awesome website now, where you can buy cool things like the Bourbon blade. And when your business changes, as it inevitably does, if you don't like the name that you started out with and you already picked one web domain, well, you can buy another web domain directly through Squarespace and link that to your new website. So you don't have to rebuild a whole new website if you change your business or your business name. So if you want to check out Squarespace, this is what you should do. Go to squarespace.com/BourbonMothWoodworking, and you're going to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain when you use the coupon code BourbonMothWoodworking. Believe me, just check it out. You're going to be shocked at how easy it is to make an awesome looking website.